With that being said, let us move on to the next session for this afternoon, titled Rewilding the Only Hope. We all know these are difficult times, and we are facing an unprecedented loss of biodiversity. Ecosystems critical for supporting both humans and biodiversity are in danger of being irrevocably lost. Amidst this doom and gloom, the idea of rewilding has been gaining increasing popularity. But what really is rewilding? What should its goal be, especially for an urbanizing country like India? What are the ethical implications of rewilding? And most importantly, how can each one of us contribute environmentally and socially to the rewilding of the planet? In this session, we will talk about all this and more, and why, for a planet in crisis, rewilding may be our only hope. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let me take this moment to invite the moderator for this session, none other than Ms. Seema Muntoli. Please to join me on the dais, ma'am. Ms. Seema Muntoli is a faculty at Azim Premji University, where she has taught in the postgraduate programs and currently teaches the undergraduate program. She has around 20 years of experience working in the areas of conservation, advocacy issues of indigenous communities, and more recently on role of nature in cities, urban sustainability, and climate change. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals and appeared in popular press. Her publications include the co-authored books, Cities and Canopies, Trees in Indian Cities, which won the Publishing Next Printed Book of the Year award and was on the Green Literature Festival honor list. So many leaves and shades of blues connecting the drops in India's cities, and the list just goes on. We are extremely honored to have you with us here, and over to you, ma'am, for the session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. After a very exciting quiz, I might have to start with a little bit of gloom and doom. I mean, when we're talking about rewilding, we're essentially talking about a planet that is in crisis and what we want to do about it. And I have three co-panelists with me who will be sharing their perspectives, individual perspectives on rewilding, because rewilding means many different things to different people. And since it first appeared maybe around in the 90s, it has become a term that has been used in many different ways. And I would like to use this opportunity to talk to the three of them and get their views on what rewilding means to them, because they all come from very different parts of the globe as well and have very different work experiences in this context. So, should I do the introductions? Okay, so I would like to first invite Alister Scott, who is the director of the Global Rewilding Alliance. Next, I would like to invite Professor Ravi Chellam, a wildlife biologist and conservationist who has been the head of many different organizations. And finally, Neena Chandavarkar, who's a landscape designer and architect and has worked a lot in the urban context. Thank you.
Before we proceed with the session, a very gentle reminder. The workshop titled Nature Art Workshop by Sampita Modak has been cancelled. We will now be proceeding with Ishika Ramakrishnan's The Green Mic, and the venue is the terrace. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we start, I thought that we could all start with trying to understand what this whole thing of rewilding is all about. So maybe I'll start with you, Alister. So as we saw, there are a lot of sustainability initiatives that are coming up, but we are also living in what we know today as this triple planetary crisis of air pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss. We are losing millions of species, ecosystems irreversibly. So what can rewilding do to help this process of stemming this loss of biodiversity? But before that, what do you think rewilding is?
Thank you, Seema. So thank you everyone for having me here today. It's an incredible privilege to be in your beautiful city for the first time. Just flew in this morning to be here. So rewilding is an interesting idea that emerged about 20 years ago. We've known about nature conservation, but in the context of an increasing encroachment into natural habitats, nature conservation has become the protection of ever smaller areas of land for nature to coexist with us. So it's been forced into a sort of a retreat type defense of the last remaining wild places for nature. Eco-restoration or ecological restoration is when we take those places and we try to put them back to a particular state that they were in the past. The rewilding movement came along when people started to say that neither of these approaches were good enough. Nature often, as we know, nature often will restore herself if given enough space and time. For example, I've just come from Sydney in Australia, where because of hunting, by the mid-1980s, the number of migratory humpback whales migrating up the coast of Australia was only 4,000 animals left. Now, because the hunting has stopped, that animal population has recovered to 40,000. So they've 10 times. And we were out surfing and we could see the humpback whales broaching and spouting off the coast, and it's much more common occurrence. So we know that nature can recover if we give her the time and the space to do so. So rewilding is this slightly sort of punky idea that the previous approaches are not good enough. We need to give more space to nature, and we need to let nature lead the process. And I'll give one final definition and then hand back to you. I've seen in the book Rewilding by Kane Blythe and Paul Jepson, they define eco-restoration and nature conservation as being human-led but nature-assisted, whereas rewilding is nature-led and human-assisted. So rewilding doesn't completely let go, because obviously if you're trying to bring back, say, otters to a river system and they've gone completely missing, or as we're doing in Europe, bringing back bison, but the only remaining individuals are in Poland, and you're trying to bring them back to Spain 2,000 miles away, yes, you're going to have to give them some assistance, because there's now too much human infrastructure in the way. But so far as possible in rewilding, we let nature lead, and we only assist where she needs that assistance. And one final definition, which is that in rewilding, we don't set an end point. We don't say we are going to restore the ecosystem to how it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, because nature constantly surprises us. And so we say we let nature lead the process and decide where she wants to get to.
Taking on from what you had said, let me just first go to Ravi and come back to you again later. Do you have a different perspective on what rewilding is, Ravi?
I think language and terminology are very important, especially in the context of India, with the largest human population, highly dense population, a population which is still very much dependent on the land and biomass for its daily survival, and a country which over the centuries have actually demonstrated that nature is not apart from human life, but nature is very much a part of human life. I think if you look seriously, consciously, India is a shining example of how coexistence is possible. I mean, over the decades, whenever I've given talks outside the country, people have just been amazed that we've done such a good job with retaining our wildlife populations. So, having said that, rewilding carries enormous, potentially negative implications for how conservation is practiced in this country, because the official policy paradigm is there is wildlife and here are people, and if there are people where wildlife is, they need to be moved out. And that clearly is not the way how India has actually succeeded in conserving. And in morning, in the Nilgiri's panel discussion, we heard how invasive species have actually run rampant through bulk of our protected areas. And that's one good example as to how just blindly removing people based on a dogmatic approach to what conservation is, and to some, I don't know, for want of a better term, a Western idea of how conservation should work in this country. So to me, ecological restoration is still very much a valid term. If nature has to lead and human have to assist, ecological restoration can also be done with nature leading and with human assisting. It doesn't necessarily have to be the other way around. And the UN definition of ecological restoration is very clear, and I will read that out. Ecosystem restoration as assisting in the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded or destroyed, as well as conserving the ecosystems that are still intact. I think the operative word is conserving the ecosystems that are still intact. India can't continue to destroy functional ecosystems and then claim to be doing successful conservation. If it is not broken, why do we need to fix it? So let's not break anymore even a square meter of functional ecosystem. And we are faced with challenges of climate change, which is all pervasive. I mean, across the globe, we can't build borders to protect yourself against climate change. So this whole concept of official conservation policy in this country, especially when it comes to tiger reserves, that people cannot stay there, I think is a self-defeating policy. If I'm not very diplomatic, I would say this is also a disguised attempt at continuing land grab, because local people are not welcome in tiger reserves, but if it is a coal mine or a highway or a dam, somehow that becomes allowable. Who is going to have a bigger impact on the habitat? The dam, the mine, the infrastructure, or local people living? And that's a question all of us need to ponder about.
Okay, so that's a completely different perspective on rewilding in the Indian context. What about you, Neena? Do you?
I think I agree with both of them at the scale at which they're talking about. For me, I'm a practitioner, I'm a landscape architect, and how I look at rewilding is at a much smaller scale, because I mean the kind of tracts of land that I work on are like maybe maximum 200, 400 acres, but I mean not at the scale of the Nilgiris or larger tracts of land, and sometimes even 20 acres or 40 acres. So for me, rewilding is bringing back habitats and restoring what is there on a site, or understanding the natural systems and finding the interconnections and reinforcing them and bringing them back to life. So it's at a smaller scale, but all these scales then all add up also to a bigger picture if you look at it. So that's the way I look at rewilding, is all these terms. I mean, in the 90s it was eco-restorations, it was habitat creation, it was conservation, now it's rewilding. I mean, these are all terms, but they're all aiming to bring back nature into our cities and into degraded and as well as areas which have been taken over by development and ruined. So it's bringing back wilderness in a way into our lives. So going back to maybe perhaps what was there before and seeing in that region, in that geography, what is native and what can sustain itself. And the sustainability is the main thing, so that once you put it there, it should either be, successional, it should take over by its own, by nature driven, or it's managed so that the invasive species are taken out and you just don't allow it to be. So it's in my case, the way I look at it is, there is a management issue to it too.
You mentioned cities, that you work in cities, so we are in what is the era of urbanization. We are going to be more than 50% population in India living in cities in the next 20 to 30 years. And there is this thing with people and nature in cities, you know, usually city residents don't want to have much of nature because it's messy, it is, a snake is a threat or a certain species is a threat. So how can you think of rewilding in an urban context?
I think in an urban context, we have to look at public spaces and existing public parks. Perhaps, you know, those parks are, you know, we've got a bit of the legacy of British and foreign kind of look that we want in our gardens. Perhaps some of those gardens, you know, we can make them a little more wild. It doesn't mean snake-ridden, it doesn't mean that. But sometimes people, when you actually talk to them, they're okay with, they're not so scared. I have a snake in my house every now and then, and so do they. So they've come to live with it in a city like Bangalore too. And not all of them are poisonous. Like, you know, in the morning we had a session where the gentleman from IISc said there are only 6 snakes in all of India that are poisonous. So all the snakes that we've just got this fear because of media, because of, you know, that snakes are biting so-and-so and whatever. So what I'm saying is people will learn to live with nature, as well as I think we have to change people's view of what is nature and what is wild. And it has to change from beautiful is lawn and beautiful is not wild nature. So I think that change has to come about, and it can come about by demonstration in public spaces, in parks, you know, there's a lot of rejuvenation of nalas now in Bangalore. Some of those can also have, I mean, rather than making a concrete edge on either side, it can be a natural edge, and people can enjoy what could be nature in its true form.
Yes, I mean, that is an interesting point, because most of the species that municipalities like to plant are these purely ornamental landscape kind of species, which may not be even relevant for the local population's use.
And they consume a lot of water and they need maintenance. So I'm saying there is also a positive side to going wild, because it's sustainable and it does not require so much manpower and water, which is such an important resource in our city.
So coming back to Alister, you saw Ravi's idea of rewilding as a little bit problematic in the Indian context, because we have a large population, we are the most populous country, and a large population of the country is dependent on natural resources. Coexistence has been in the country's thing. So, and the idea now is that what national parks and sanctuaries in this country have done should not become what rewilding also does. So what do you think is for India, what should be rewilding look like?
Okay. Thank you, and it's a great challenge, Ravi, a completely legitimate challenge. In the Global Rewilding Alliance, we are an alliance of rewilding organizations around the world. As of yesterday, we have 223 organizations operating in over 125 countries, influencing the rewilding of about 2.5 million square kilometers of land and about 5 million square kilometers of ocean. So that's about 5 times the size of France. Sorry, I'm from Europe. I don't know the comparison with India, but you know, it's a big area of land and an even bigger area of ocean. So out of those 223 organizations, I would say that exactly 0 are advocating the removal of people from landscapes in order to help nature to recover. There is absolutely 0 tolerance of that kind of policy in our members. And there is an ugly history, especially in the United States and in many colonial countries, countries with colonial history, and again, sorry for being British, that in these countries, in South Africa, in a lot of African countries, and in India, there was a tradition of removing people from landscapes. For example, Yellowstone National Park, people were deliberately moved from that landscape, partly as part of the persecution of indigenous peoples during the European move going west. And there was this idea of wilderness. The concept of wilderness was created to create this false idea that untouched landscape was the only legitimately wild landscape with no humans in it. But as we know, through history, indigenous peoples have worked with the land and worked with nature in incredibly sustainable ways in the great majority of cases. I've just been to Australia, amazing history there. And I would contrast this concept of wilderness with wildness. What we're looking for is wildness. We're looking for more wildness. And as you've just said, you can have more wildness in your house, in your garden, on your balcony, in your street, by planting trees, by creating a corridor for birds to go along, by having green spaces in your parks. And all of this is happening. So in London, for example, in the royal parks, they are now allowing certain areas to regenerate naturally and become thorny scrub, because this is a fantastic habitat. They look at Berlin, for example, where you have hundreds of pairs of nightingales nesting and singing all night their beautiful song that has 1,500 different expressions in the song of the nightingale. They're all over Berlin. Why? Because they have scruffy bits in the city. And London is now learning from that and bringing that wildness into the city. But this is not wilderness. This is not wilderness without people. That was a construct that served a certain purpose for people in power. And I see absolutely no tolerance of that in the rewilding movement. We are a deeply social movement, and all of the organizations that I work with recognize the failures of development assistance over the last 100 years, that if you come in from outside and you impose solutions on local people, number one, they won't work, and number two, they'll be very destructive on traditions and on communities. So I think the rewilding movement has genuinely learned from that, and we work with indigenous people and local communities from the design stage of projects on governance, on ownership, and on benefiting from and working in those projects. So I think it's a great challenge, and I can see how, for example, I did my undergraduate dissertation in Thailand looking at two different models of community forestry, and there the Royal Forest Department, again a colonial sort of shadow, if you like, were throwing people out of the forests and were creating little plots of eucalyptus for them to use as firewood. Eucalyptus, not even a native species, and it burns really easily. So it's just crazy, stupid policy. So that's a million miles from what our version of rewilding is about. But thank you for the challenge.
So in which case then I'll ask Ravi and be a little bit of a devil's advocate here and say that people have always, as humans, we have not always been very good with protecting species or taking care of them. We are the cause for extinctions, and even indigenous communities and local communities have played a role in it, but nothing, of course, at the scale of what we who are a part of the capitalist economy are. So there should be some scope for rewilding in India to protect some species. Do you think that is that something that can't be completely overruled?
Well, the headline-grabbing rewilding event is the Cheetah Project. I don't have to say more. If you've been reading the news, you know how well or how poorly the Cheetah Project is performing. When you start with the view that people and wildlife are not compatible, and Alister has clarified what he means by rewilding, but today, without even rewilding, the official conservation policy is throw the people out. If you bring the term rewilding in, it will only strengthen that argument, because to them, it's about wilderness, right? Words in policy, official communication, even in legislation, like pristine nature, inviolate habitats. In the era of climate change, what the hell are we talking about? Who is causing this climate change? Why are people who have the least carbon footprint continue to pay the cost for conservation? And what do we do after throwing them out? We open 5-star safaris with swimming pools and sauna baths at the very same places. I mean, how the hell is that morally justifiable? To me, if India over the next century can even take good, strong steps towards first completely putting an end to further fragmentation, degradation, destruction of natural habitats, that's a huge win. We don't even have to do restoration, rewilding. Stop the nonsense of destroying nature in the name of development. It's not development. It's committing suicide. That's number one. Number two, focus on ecological restoration. Be inclusive, be just. Build on traditional knowledge. I mean, the whole lantana thing tells us that if we were to listen to the local communities, we wouldn't have even had this lantana problem. They had a low-cost, regular way of dealing with it. But people like me go there and say, we are the scientists, we know better, and we are paying the consequences for that. And unfortunately, Alister, this whole colonial attitude, only the color of the skin has changed, but in operation, the colonial operation continues. As recently as June or July of this year, the National Tiger Conservation Authority has issued a letter to all the chief wildlife wardens of tiger-bearing states, providing a list of tiger reserves, providing a list of number of families in there, and asking them to relocate the people outside the tiger reserves. Of course, the word voluntary is used, but we all know how voluntary these relocations are. So it's not something in the past, it's very much something in our present, and that is why I bristle when terms like rewilding are thrown at us.
You're definitely bristling. But coming to Nina, let's look at in the urban context where we are trying to establish this connect with nature. As a landscape architect, you may have worked with a lot of projects, maybe with IT companies or apartment complexes, where most of them usually want to have palm trees or some kind of nature. So how can you share something about how you were able to make them think otherwise about rewilding with specific species?
I think views are changing a little bit. I mean, perhaps this palm tree Dubai look has slowly faded, I would say, because it's been done and then rejected. Of course, there are traces of it, but I think most people are getting conscious, and I think the awareness is slowly trickling in. I'm not saying it's 100% there, but I think to be able to change people's mindsets is to make them more aware. So the idea is when we have clients who I'm engaging with, is to make them aware of the benefits of the wild, or the natural, or the native. See, native has become a wild use also now. I mean, what is native and what can we call native? But there is a slight sensitization because of some of the bylaws that have come in with the green building, etc., that you have to put native trees, you have to, devote certain areas of your landscape to, of a complex to landscape. So I think the awareness is coming in, and slowly one is trying to reinforce that ultimately they also have to look at the management and the money. And if you tell them, you convince them that you grow more trees, you have a grassland, you have a wetland, you have a retention pond, it helps them. It builds up the humidity in the soil. It translates, you have to translate it into something that they can perceive. And that's how you change mindsets. And that is what one tries to achieve. I mean, if you have 200 acres, like a project I did for IIM, Trichy, 200 acres you cannot landscape and irrigate. So you can try and convince them that let natural grasses grow in this area. Devote 40% of that project was wild. So, they will buy into it because it's also in software parks. It brings down the temperature. You have to equate it into something that they can understand. But then you reach your goal, and that's your goal,
Thank you. I've just been shown the screen that there are only 5 minutes left. So maybe we could take a couple of audience questions.
Hi, so Seema mentioned that about urbanization, like 50% of the population is going to live in the cities. So the root cause of the problem is moving of the people from the other areas to the cities. So why don't we directly address that problem and make people live in their own areas rather than coming to the cities, rather than after the fact, after they move to urban, try to landscape, try to do rewilding and all that. This is a question for all the panel.
Well, that can only happen if jobs and other things are given to people where they live. I mean, so we have to decentralize and not concentrate everything in big cities. So that's a policy thing. And you can't help people from aspiring. I mean, we all have aspirations and we cannot judge somebody else's aspirations. So you have to give them what they want where they are.
One of the most difficult things to reconcile is what is government and BBMP's view of how the city should be redone, and how private people, little bit better educated and little bit more aware, get down to doing things. I mean, for example, BBMP has put up these tall Christmas trees on the roads, and these have just become screens for public urination now. The pavements in Bangalore are stinking throughout. So how do we...
So,
is any
Ratnam,
thought...
right?
Sorry?
Your name is Ratnam, if
Yes.
I'm not... Yeah, so that's a very specific question, a BBMP thing. I'm not sure...
No, are you able to reconcile with them? Do you have a clash with them at all?
I mean, maybe...
You operate on your own? Huh.
Thanks everyone. That was a great discussion. Lots of interesting thoughts floating about. So one takeaway I think between Ravi and Alister, you haven't reconciled the whole idea of terminology, right? Should you be using the term rewilding at all? I think Ravi, you kind of feel that the term itself is detrimental. But leaving aside the exact terms, if Alister's kind of idea of rewilding is to be more human inclusive, one, you think it's worth putting on the website a more human inclusive definition of rewilding so that it doesn't mean different things for different people around the world, and it doesn't carry the negative connotation and the baggage that rewilding normally constitutes in India. But leaving aside the terminology question, the kind of question I have more is, how do you distinguish between what are just vanity projects? Ravi's favorite thing is the cheetahs. He absolutely loves that project. I'm sure everyone here is aware of it. But you have, say, the Zimov brothers, father and son, doing Pleistocene rewilding and trying to bring the mammoth back in Siberia. You have Josh Donlan's idea of rewilding America, of replacing functional roles. So bring back Asiatic elephants in America, bring back tigers, bring back a whole range of pre-Ice Age kind of mammals to fill in certain functional roles. So where do you draw the line between what is a reasonable project, irrespective of whether you call it rewilding or Pleistocene rewilding or restoration, and what is just a vanity project, right? In terms of spending a huge amount of money with no real ecological benefit or benefit to people. Have you tried to kind of chart out that, draw that line somewhere and kind of differentiate between different kinds of projects? Or are you okay to be all-inclusive and accepting?
Yeah, so my personal philosophy is that the rewilding movement should be an open and tolerant movement that encourages innovation and risk-taking and trying things out. Because our crises, our interlinked crises, are too big and too urgent to hang about. And I'm certainly not in the business of saying, well, you're in and you're out. You're pure enough and you're not pure enough. We see what happens in secular society and in religions and so on. I grew up in Northern Ireland, where two types of Christians were killing each other. And I learnt then and there to be suspicious of any extreme ideology. So my personal leaning is towards tolerance and experimentation. So, you know, we've got to try everything. I think we've got to try everything. I think it's great what they're doing in the Pleistocene Park in Siberia. I think they should be allowed to try it. Because, you know why? Potentially you've got the methane bomb, with the melting of the permafrost. And they are showing, with rigorous scientific evidence, that when you bring back big herbivores into that landscape, the permafrost, a meter down, is 5 degrees colder, potentially preventing the methane escaping and creating the methane bomb, which then will lead to a tipping point in the atmosphere. So I don't see why we would not experiment with that and back those people. But the great majority of the rewilding movement is doing the hard, pragmatic stuff of helping nature to recover in a myriad places. I'll give you one example. At the end of the civil war in Mozambique, 1 million people had been killed. All of the major wildlife had been eradicated because people were hungry, fair enough, they needed to eat. Peace Parks Foundation, which is an alliance partner, it's one of Nelson Mandela's legacy organizations, has this view that we can help restore relations between countries that have previously been at war because wildlife does not recognize national boundaries. And they have now translocated 18,000 animals, whole herds of antelope, hippopotamuses. I've seen elephants under helicopters, giraffes. How do you translocate a giraffe 100 miles or 1,000 miles? Avoid low bridges. I mean, it's extraordinary work. But this is putting back in place what's gone missing. And by putting back the keystone species, the whole landscape in Mozambique has come to life, including, making amazing livelihoods for local people who have been involved from the outset. So I just think, we've got branches and twigs, which are interesting, but let's not focus on them. A question I get in England is often, oh, you want to bring wolves back into London? And I always say, well, no, that's not where we're starting. Focus on the trunk of the tree. We're just bringing nature back into people's lives in a very pragmatic and sensible way. There's nothing extreme about this ideology.
Do we have time for one last question, or one more question from anyone?
Yeah, I have one question, which is, we touched upon some larger trends of, government and development. Can any of the panelists speak about the impact of the agrarian sort of sector, meaning the population of the earth is expected to reach 10 billion, maybe more. How do we feed everyone, especially with climate change and all of those things, and how does rewilding sort of situate itself into that context?
I can certainly answer.
First of all, I have not subscribed to the idea of rewilding. I'm still with ecosystem restoration. I think healthy ecosystems will result in healthy human beings. Their well-being will increase, mental and physical well-being. Today, our agricultural fields are very external input driven. Our subsidy model is like that. So you have to change the way of doing business. Doing business as usual and expecting everything else to fall in place is not going to happen. Why are we going and destroying Great Nicobar? For what are we doing that? Why are we building large dams in Arunachal? Submerging rainforests. You can't keep doing all of that and expect the rest of the, and interlinking rivers. Rivers, if they had to be linked, they would have been linked. Rivers have tributaries, have distributaries, they have estuaries, they have deltas. Where is the lack of connection? This whole short-term, techno-arrogant view that human beings, engineering can fix all our problems, unless you change that attitude, unless you change our budgeting. Why are we putting so much money into something called defense and national security when getting clean air, clean water is proving to be difficult? What is the use of national security if you can't breathe clean air and drink clean water and have 3 square meals a day? So we need to question all of this. You don't expect the same usual way of budgeting, functioning, 5 years elections and so on, and the rest of the problems to be resolved. We need a paradigm shift, and enough of us need to stand up and be counted. We need to speak, and we are not doing that enough.
So I think we can agree to disagree that rewilding is one of the hopes, maybe not the only hopes. It can be context specific, it can be area specific, but as Alister has also said, not excluding people, but making a space for them. So maybe we will leave it at that for now, and yeah, they could shake hands. So thank you, Nina, Ravi, and Alister for this wonderful, spicy session on rewilding, which is perhaps one of our hopes for the future, and we each do it in the way we can do it best.
Well, thank you so much for that insightful session. Let me take the privilege of inviting Mr. Vasant Bosco onto the dais. Please do join us, sir.
Can I just say, so Alister has shared this book with me, I forgot to mention this, the little book of making big change happen. So I just wanted to mention this as well. Thank you, sorry for interrupting.
All right, Mr. Vasant, please do join us on the dais. He is a regeneration ecologist as well as the author of The Voice of the Ancient Highlands. And we have a token of appreciation for our panelists. Can we please have a group photograph?